Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of Remade, Rebooted, or Retired. My name is Canadian Guy A, and I cannot wait to start the show for you today. This is actually the third episode of the series, and it's going to be interesting to combine a subject that I normally do talk about with this show. So, strap in and let's get started. Before we begin, we need to clarify what each term means. For this show, a remake can be anything from a simple graphical remaster to a massive overhaul. The game can be rebuilt from the ground up, but if the developer's intentions is to try to follow the original titles as close as possible, then it will still be considered a remake. A reboot, however, is when most, if not all aspects of the previous games are ignored and essentially started from scratch. Story elements, themes, and ideas from the original games can be used, but in general, it's starting with a clean slate. So, without further ado, let's get into today's episode.
Sony Computer Entertainment America presents a Universal Interactive Studios production, developed by Eurocom Entertainment Software. Crash Bash!
Crash Bash was the final Crash Bandicoot game that came out on its premier console, the PlayStation 1. This was actually the first Crash Bandicoot that was made after Naughty Dog walked away from Universal. Naughty Dog had made their mark in history with their original Crash Bandicoot trilogy, flexing that each game sold an average of 7 million copies and essentially became the mascot of PlayStation to go toe-to-toe with the gaming giant Nintendo. However, though Crash was looked after fondly by PlayStation, Universal had the rights to both Crash and Spyro, and neither Naughty Dog, Insomniac, or Sony owned the rights to these characters. After completing yet another legendary game, Crash Bandicoot Warped, Naughty Dog felt it was time for them to make a brand new game. Many have asked why would Naughty Dog walk away from one of the most legendary IPs of all time, but unfortunately, Universal became infamous for their terrible crunch times, poor communication, poor work conditions, pettiness, and overall did not know how to run a game studio if it meant their life. This was essentially the reason why both Naughty Dog and Insomniac walked away from both Crash and Spyro. As Naughty Dog was about to leave the grasp of Universal with a bang due to their abusive and horrid working conditions, they wanted to do something different and their interest was directed into a racing game. However, the tensions were coming to a head between Universal and Naughty Dog, but after the heads of PlayStation had come to talk with Naughty Dog, they worked out a deal that they could make this kart racing game as long as it was Crash Bandicoot themed. So, right before Naughty Dog dropped the mic and left to go make Jak and Daxter, they dropped one of the best kart racers of all time, Crash Team Racing, a game that at first glance seemed to be a copy of Mario Kart, but actually was a fantastic kart racer that is still played to this day, and now has been brought back to life by Beanox in a modern day remake. But Universal, being the daft, uninformative dingbats, didn't know what to do with the Crash IP when Naughty Dog left, so assumedly they passed the game off to a company called Eurocom, and likely told them to just try and copy what Mario was doing. So with Crash Team Racing likely being viewed as a copy of Mario Kart spin-off and seeing the success it got, maybe they could do the same with Mario's party game spin-off, Mario Party, and thus Crash Bash was created. Crash Bash was a 4-player party game, bringing in characters from the entire Crash universe and introducing one new one, Rillaroo. Shockingly, like Crash Team Racing, Crash Bash had an unexpected story with 2 different endings. Aku Aku and Uka Uka want to finally settle who's truly better, good or evil. When Uka Uka challenges Aku Aku to a fight, Aku Aku tells him that the ancients will not allow it. But wait, isn't that what you're doing at the end of Crash Bandicoot 3 Warped? You know, firing laser beams at each other, viciously spinning one against another? Wouldn't that be considered a fight? Or just an aggressive tango? Anyway, logic and story aside, both Uka Uka and Aku Aku decide that they will make 2 teams, Team Good and Team Evil. Depending on who you select in the character select screen will determine which ending you will get if you win overall. Now there were too many bad guys and Aku Aku demanded it to be fair as he only had Crash and Coco. So Aku Aku chose Dingodile and Tiny Tiger for his team. By the way, I still don't understand why Entropy couldn't partake in this contest, but that's besides the point. You then go through a series of mini games to determine who is the best team, and that's the story. I mean, granted, it's a party game, so if you were expecting anything groundbreaking, I don't know what to tell you. The minigames in this party game are actually a buttload of fun. One of my favorites is Crash Ball, where you essentially are trying to score against 3 other players to reduce their points to 0. The last person standing wins. This is a common theme followed through all the minigames, where you either have to have the most points or basically be the last one standing as you try to blow each other up in some way, shape, or form. Once you finish the first world in all their games, you go to the boss world where you have to fight a boss in some other form of a minigame. Once they are defeated, you move on to the next world. But for that inner completionist, you can revisit the first set of minigames and do different challenges, where you can play the same minigame but with different handicaps or challenges, allowing you to unlock more collectibles to use later on. Then you can go to a level called Beach Ball, where you play the same reskinned Crash Ball minigame with a bit more challenge to it than the original. Then you go to the next level, which is, again, another reskin of a previous minigame with a bit more challenges where you could replay it and unlock more collectibles. Then when you make it to the third world, you can play Embolism, which is another reskin of... You seeing a pattern yet? This was a huge critique of the game when it came to fans and critics, where, yes, it's fun, but then after doing the challenges and then playing a reskin of the first levels, but just a bit harder, soured a lot of people's thoughts about the game, making the minigames feel unoriginal. Granted, however, later on in the game, new and better minigames started arising, or certain reskin minigames were different enough to stand on its own as a new game, but the majority of the game is just playing the same few games over and over again, especially if you wanted to do the challenge levels. But thinking in context, I think that if the game were to come back, new and even better mini-games could come along with a much larger cast of characters. So, without further ado, should Crash Bash be remade, rebooted, or retired? Retired. Okay, so I know there's going to be a lot of angry people, but I am going to defend my judgment on this game. So I'm going to come at this in a business point of view and a personal subjective point of view. On the possibility of a remake, in terms of business, Crash Bash was the worst selling, lowest critics scored Crash game on the PlayStation 1. On top of that, the content of the actual game is actually quite small. Back then, games that size were acceptable, but nowadays, games need to be longer to validate someone to buy it. Any of the Crash and Spyro games from the original trilogies would not have been worth it to make on their own, so they combined all 3 games and reduced the overall price to make it overall worth it to the average consumer. You have to remember, you have to market to not just a die-hard fan base, but the average consumer as well, as they will be the majority of your income. Crash Bash is essentially a shorter game than any of the standalone Crash or Spyro games, and doesn't have any other game to back it up, except for Crash Boom Bang, which, you know, totally did fantastic. But what if it was rebooted? What if a brand new Crash Party game was made from the ground up with the spirit of the original Crash Bash? Could that work? Well, I'll ask you a question. What was the last major party game that came out? Most will say Mario Party for the Switch, which is the obvious choice. But even the premier party game couldn't even score an average of an 8 with the critics. Most party games that are just jam-packed full of mini-games are now just viewed as nothing but shovelware and low-quality content. So even if the new Crash Bash came out, it would have an attached thought that it would not be great due to it just being a bunch of mini-games with no real story. On top of that, Crash fans have been wanting new content for years now. If a Crash Bash reboot or remake were to come out, that would be even more waiting for Crash fans who just want to play a classic platformer. Now, is it possible that there could be Crash Bash-like minigames in the new upcoming Crash game? Sure, I don't think that's an unreasonable thought. Some of those games are great fun, but to bring the whole game, it just doesn't seem like a good business choice. I have a lot of nostalgic memories of this game, but when I streamed the game last year, that love was just gone. When playing by yourself, the game loses a lot of its luster and charm. It's a weird grasp at trying to find nostalgia, and it feels like a ghost. Overall, this is one game that we should leave to rest. If you really want to play Crash Bash, simply put it on an emulator.